I'm gonna get into some late game spoilers with this review, and I have a lot to unpack. So for anyone who doesn't want to get spoiled and would like to go into the game blind, here's the general gist of it spoiler free. First of all, the game's a 6 out of 10. I want to be clear, that's not bad. 5 out of 10 is average, that's not bad either. 6 out of 10 is above average, which is exactly what Elden Ring is. It's above average. It's not bad at all. I don't know what the hell everyone is on about with these 10 out of 10 scores flying around everywhere though. The game's got too many problems holding it back that I don't approve of. And it is most definitely not for everyone. Well, that statement on its own should be obvious, what with the usual parade of Dark Souls should have an easy mode headlines that always manage to crop up like a seasonal flu. But when I mean it's not for everyone, I'm also including the typical Souls veteran in there, like myself. I recognize the strengths of the game, but I just don't care for the whole package all that much. The open world is massive and beautiful, but once you get over the presentation, you'll find that it's also very empty, and you'll spend about half the game riding your horse past enemies on the field and checking out landmarks on the map for new gear that you'll probably never use anyway. Of course, adventure should be its own reward, but once everything starts to look and feel the same, it starts to feel more like a chore than a fun time. The repetition sets in way too fast in this game. The dungeon designs and layouts are good enough. FromSoftware tends to have a decent track record for this, but I would say that it's far from their best stuff. None of it's as bad as Launch Day Shrine of Amina, and admittedly, they do some interesting stuff with branching paths in some of these. But other dungeons range from overly big and open to obnoxious mazes of cramped and narrow hallways. A couple of the main story bosses don't even have dungeons associated with them at all. You just ride right up to their arena in the open world and then that's it. And speaking of bosses, several of them get repeated way too often. They seriously got carried away with that. And the plethora of smaller dungeons, caves, and catacombs just reminding me of Bloodborne's Chalice dungeons doesn't help either. My biggest personal gripe, however, is the insane difficulty of the later boss designs. As someone who loves the fight against Nameless King in Dark Souls 3, I never thought I'd say this, but Elden Ring is just way too hard. The toughest fights come off as if they were designed with cooperative play in mind, either with friends online or by selecting from a hefty collection of computer-controlled allies. Granted, skilled players can make even the toughest fights work one-on-one without any cheap gimmicks, but man, I'm telling you, you simply can't hide behind a great shield, rely on medium rolls, and use your big old great axe to punish boss openings anymore. It's just not viable against some of the later bosses. And that's such a drastic shift in design that I really don't agree with. If you still want to go into the game blind, and believe me, after hearing all that, I'd still want to go into the game blind too, but listen, all I'm saying is, you've been warned. You can't simply approach Elden Ring like it's another Dark Souls. It certainly gives that impression at first, but you gotta man up for the endgame. Take that as a challenge if you want, but I mean it more so as a warning. With all that out of the way, I'll move on to the spoiler talk and my more detailed impressions on why I feel the way I do. The storytelling is the usual approach that FromSoftware has been doing. You either love it or hate it at this point. Personally, I like it well enough. I'm not big into the whole lore discussion stuff like some people are, but I do enjoy reading item descriptions and casually piecing together bits of the world's history and lore on my own. I will say that every Souls game gets more and more expansive with each iteration, and Elden Ring takes the cake. The scope of the lore in this game is ridiculous. If you thought the crazier endings in Bloodborne were a bit much, you ain't seen nothing yet. Personally, I prefer the smaller stories in Demon Souls and Sekiro, where everything is more isolated to a single country and it doesn't feel like the entire world has undergone the apocalypse. But Elden Ring is pretty cool, and I do really like the history that they've created for this world. The visuals as well is much of the same. If you really look up close at the details, then Elden Ring isn't necessarily impressive as far as the raw graphical fidelity goes. It's nowhere near the technical expertise of Capcom's and Square Enix's better looking games. However, From Software's titles have always excelled at phenomenal art design, and this one's no different. The landscapes and vistas are absolutely beautiful, and it's not uncommon to find yourself staring out in the distance off of a cliffside just to take in the scenery. While I preferred the art direction in the world of Sekiro, Elden Ring is a very close second. Every bit of landscape is mesmerizing. And, as usual, From Software just has to show off its always active open world. If you place a marker on the map, then you can see it from miles away, giving a great indication of the scale of the world, and the gargantuan golden tree in the center of it all makes for a fantastic global landmark and always present objective to reach for. As far as the look of the game goes, From Software nailed it again. The music is just okay. The main theme is killer, that's for sure, as is the song for the final boss. And a couple of other tracks here and there are awesome too. However, very few songs really stood out to me, which is how I usually feel about the soundtracks in these games. They're pretty generic, epic fantasy kind of fare, perfectly serviceable and quite good overall, but nothing too special. It's worth mentioning though that, unlike the previous games, Elden Ring finally makes use of an ongoing background music outside of boss battles. This is something I've wanted for a long time, and they've pulled it off very well here, even better than when Sekiro did it. Every area of the game has its own regular and battle themes that transition into each other seamlessly, and there are quite a few of them. I'm glad they're finally embracing this. I always find the quietness of the older games to be kind of lame. The presentation is solid, as usual. You can't really go wrong with these games. What's a lot more surprising are all the gameplay changes, for better and for worse. The usual Souls combat remains very much the same, to the point that it actually feels extremely similar to Dark Souls 3 in particular. But there are a lot of new additions as well. One of the biggest is a new guard counter, whereby pressing the heavy attack button right after a successful guard will activate a quick reversal. Don't think it's a replacement for parries, guard counters have their weaknesses as well. They won't stop an enemy's combo, so doing it at the wrong time will still leave you open. And if you mistime the guard counter, then you just end up doing a really slow heavy attack, which will also leave you open. It's also a little bit inefficient in its use of stamina, but the positives are that it's very easy to utilize and deals good damage, making it a great option to easily dispense of predictable enemies. Elden Ring also includes a dedicated jump button. Finally! This replaces the previous game's forward plus heavy attack to do a jumping attack, and it also gets rid of that awful dash jump. I never would have guessed how much of a difference jumping could make in these games, but it's such a big deal that I think I'd have a hard time going back to the old ways. Jumping can also be used to great effect in avoiding lower sweeping attacks while moving in at the same time, although this is extremely risky. Very rarely will jumping be a factor in avoiding telegraphed attacks, but it is cool when the game does so. There's also a lot more platforming in this game, both for mandatory progression and to find secrets, although thankfully it's not a big focus. As much as I love the dedicated jumping, platforming is definitely not Elden Ring's strong suit. Stealth was always sort of in the other games to some degree, but Elden Ring is the first one to truly embrace it, not counting Sekiro. There's a new dedicated crouch that completely silences your footsteps and can even brush up against an enemy to ensure that you're close enough to do a backstab. Using tall grass to hide from patrols is a thing too, and you can pretty easily sneak past a bunch of enemies if you don't want to fight anyone on the way to the boss. Overall, I'd say this mechanic is unnecessary, but it doesn't distract from the core of the game either, and I'm sure there are those who will find it neat. Aside from that, there's not a whole lot else that's new in terms of direct combat. Sorceries and miracles, now called incantations, function similarly, as do the returning weapon skills, all of which feed from a blue bar called the focus points that basically manages your resource for magic. However, customization in this game has been given a massive overhaul. Weapon skills and elemental infusions now go hand in hand, and they can be easily equipped, unequipped, and swapped around at no cost. You no longer have to invest in making a weapon a specific element and sticking with it for pretty much the whole game. Now you can keep your favorite and switch between fire, lightning, heavy scaling, normal scaling, your choice. The same goes for weapon skills. If you weren't a fan of the stomp abilities on ultra greatswords, well, now you can change it for the battlecry buff, an elemental ranged attack, or pretty much whatever you want. There are limitations. Elements and skills are tied together, so you can't have an ice-based skill while infusing your weapon with lightning. They need to be compatible too. Some of these are only usable as spears, some are exclusive to katanas, and shields get a few of these as well. One of the greatest strengths of the Souls games has been their customization, and the replayability that comes from it. Elden Ring already does a lot in this regard. It's gotta have the largest collection of weapons, armors, and spells to date. But its greatest addition is definitely the reworked infusions and skill system. Most people might contribute that to the new open world aspect of the game, but anyone who knows me knows that I'm usually not the biggest fan of this stuff. To be fair, Elden Ring does make good use of its humongous map. Each major area has its own style, and the land gradually changes as you travel the countryside. They also implemented the typical day-night cycle, although in this game it doesn't really seem to make that much of a difference. I think some enemies are a little bit more aggressive at nighttime, and a few exclusive bosses that patrol the overworld only appear at night, but that's kind of it. It's mostly for visuals than anything else. It's beautiful to explore, but even if no two places look the same, it still gets old fast. When you get down to it, you're only traveling from point A to point B, and what you do in between doesn't matter all that much. You can follow the main objective easily enough, or you can closely examine the map and seek out some landmarks. The sense of discovery when you find a hidden dungeon or a rundown shack that houses an NPC is always cool, but that doesn't change the fact that riding around on horseback is very low stakes, which makes it boring after a while. Perhaps more impressive is how open the game really is. You can explore a shocking amount of the world without even fighting the first boss of the game, and it's not difficult to do so. It's pretty cool for subsequent playthroughs that you can skip straight to the places that have your favorite gear, and then play the rest of the game from there. You know how people make a big deal about Dark Souls letting you skip straight to the end of Blighttown with the Master Key? Well, Elden Ring puts that to shame. As for how much that actually adds to the game is questionable. I would have preferred something more direct and focused. I always wish From Software would consider going back to the style of Demon Souls with its Arkstones, instead of having a single interconnected world. But I get it, people think that stuff is rad, so fine. As for the multiplayer, this isn't an aspect I've typically cared for in these games, either cooperatively or competitively. I dabbled in it a little bit for the sake of this review, and it's mostly the same as usual, not anything really special. I think the netcode is better. I didn't really notice any insane lag that the series is typically infamous for, but I'm not a great judge for this either. You still need to use an item to summon other players, however, you can easily get a ton of these thanks to the new crafting system. Yes, Elden Ring has crafting. I find the concept ridiculous, but it's actually not as bad as I expected. It stays out of the way and you can ignore it for the most part, but it can be useful in situations when you might need an item to cure poison or something to throw on the ground to mark an invisible bridge. You can buy new recipes from merchants scattered across the world, but due to the very nature of the game, it's very easy to miss out on certain gear. For one thing, I sure wish I knew how to make items to cure rot. This can lead to interesting stories among friends about how you discovered so-and-so location that had this really cool thing, but in this case, it usually ends up with finding something that's borderline useless or something that's insanely busted. Anyone who didn't discover things like Hoarfrost Stomp or the Sword of Night and Flame are no doubt going to have a way harder time than those who did. If you have the right weapons and the right abilities, and you're willing to abuse their power, you essentially play on easy mode. Not to mention that, as a very strange choice, certain upgrades are now locked behind item acquisitions. For example, in order to upgrade the number of healing potions that you can carry at a time, you simply have to find these golden trees scattered throughout the world. And in order to upgrade their effectiveness, you have to find these rundown churches. What this means is that you can pretty easily get to like 10 healing potions at a level of +5 really early in the game. It feels a little overpowered, I don't know, it's weird for a Dark Souls game to give me so much healing right off the bat. Who knows, maybe that's part of the reason why they made this one so hard. The maximum slots for magic memorization is also upgraded by collecting these memory stones, as opposed to upgrading stats like it was in the previous games. I can't say I necessarily hate that change nearly as much, but still, it's just, I don't know, it's a weird change, especially considering that, again, if you know where to go, you can collect a few of these right away. It's a similar case with expanding your maximum accessory slots as well, although the talisman pouches are much more rare in this case. Another really cool addition that I want to bring up before moving on is the Flask of Wondrous Physic. This new reusable potion can be customized with various effects, such as healing you, improving your elemental attack power, or just causing you to explode. The viability and effectiveness of some of these is debatable, but even the more basic effects such as temporary stamina regeneration can help make a pretty big difference. It's a shame that technically an optional item like this has so much potential. I wouldn't be surprised if some players completely missed out on this one. Granted, there is a hint you can buy from a merchant to help point you in the right direction, but again, for such a big open world with so much to see, it can be easy to miss out on some of the cooler stuff. If you know where to go ahead of time, or if you stumble upon the best stuff, or if you're like me and you're really trying to do your due diligence and spend over 100 hours exploring everywhere, then you've kind of unlocked easy mode as long as you're willing to use some of the crazier things you can find. Speaking of easy mode, while the Souls games have never had a traditional difficulty selection, I always saw cooperative play as an olive branch for players having a hard time, not counting those who don't really care and just purely want to play the game for fun. Elden Ring takes that idea much further, not only bringing back the usual co-op, but now featuring a big list of computer-controlled allies that you can summon for many areas and nearly every boss fight. The big issue is that the enemy AI doesn't really know how to deal with multiple targets. This has always been a problem for all of these games. Having just one, let alone two allies makes a huge difference, if only for helping to keep the attention off of you half the time. Relying on these summons, at least in my opinion, removes a lot of the fun of the game, but thankfully they are optional. At least, technically they're optional, but Elden Ring's bosses are something else. I don't mean to spoil too much, but I will be showing off a couple of late game bosses to help make my point. Starting early on, however, Margit is one of the first bosses you face, and he's one hell of a fight to start with. His attacks are relentless and leave very little room for openings. Worse yet, when he does appear open, he'll punish you with a rapid counterattack. His magic weapons also deal damage through your block, as if everything else wasn't enough. It's a brutal fight that seems unfair at first, But after studying his moves for hours, I began to recognize some attack cues. See how he raises his hand? Whenever he does this pose, he's actually baiting you into a counterattack every time, so don't fall for it. This was almost a really fun fight to me once I figured it out, but his second phase takes it way too far. He becomes even more aggressive with his magic weapons, has far fewer openings, and his punishes are insane now. After a lot of experimentation, I eventually discovered that he's pretty weak to poison, so I relied on a poison spell that I discovered while exploring earlier, and that finally gave me the edge I needed to beat him. Overall, not a bad fight, although the next one against Godric was much of the same, with fire attacks in the second phase leaving very little room to approach him. This style of battles continues throughout the game, with hyper-aggressive and extremely punishing bosses that they don't seem to have a suitable weakness to match their crazy power. I tried my best to persevere. I refused to rely on summons to beat the game, but it eventually became too much. I started experimenting with other cheap tactics, and that's when I learned about Hoarfrost Stomp, and all the challenge in the game immediately disappeared. Everything became a total joke. This move uses minimal focus points, has good range, speed, and a crazy amount of power. It's almost like I'm cheating, but I kinda have my back against a wall with this game. It feels bad. I wanted a challenge, but these bosses are too much. I just cannot rely on my usual Great Shield, Great Axe, and medium rolls to beat this game. I mean, just compared to Dark Souls 3, the difference is ludicrous. Dark Souls 3 gets really tough around when you fight Pontiff Sullivan and some of the later bosses like Dancer, but I'd take those fights any day over half the bosses in Elden Ring. I never thought I'd say this, but I actually appreciate the gimmick fights a little more in this game because it was something different and it didn't seem like it was balanced around over-leveling. But then you get to the end game, like this fight against Malekith, and I have no clue what you're supposed to do. This guy's speed and power is just nuts. He's jumping around all over the place and I can barely keep up with him. Millennia is another one that's totally insane. All of her sword attacks heal herself, even if you block them. So the fight turns into a war of attrition, and you're gonna run out of heals before you beat her. That was the final straw for me. I was actually getting tired of this game at this point, so I finally gave in and used one of the strongest in-game summons I had found. As you can see, the difference is just insane. The fight went from feeling impossible to being a total cakewalk. At this point, I wasn't even having that much fun anymore. I just wanted to beat the game for the sake of getting it over with. It kinda seems like Elden Ring is actually balanced around having cooperative help. There are just so many of these spirits to choose from and they can all be individually upgraded. So it makes me wonder if this was intentionally the direction that From Software wanted to go in. Even if it was, it still seems foolish to me because again, they've never updated the engine's artificial intelligence. It's bad enough that if you know what you're doing and you're positioned correctly, you can easily cheese enemies in certain situations. But even worse, for the standalone boss fights, they practically fall apart when you have an ally or two on your side. It doesn't help either when they clearly start glitching up. Yet, this boss isn't supposed to be able to just cancel and restart his rolling animation on a dime like this. How can you expect me not to be cheap just so I can get this over with already? Some of these bosses are so cheap. Anyone who's fought Praetor Miriam knows what I'm talking about. This fight is absurdly annoying to figure out and get good at. But with enough patience, I finally nailed it. Just gonna get another backstab in and... You know, now that I think about it, this is the glitchiest Souls game that From Software has ever made. It's not unplayable because of that, don't get me wrong, but you put enough hours into this game and you're bound to run into something. Speaking of enough hours, I clocked in at a grand total of 150. I really took my time exploring as much as I could. I went out of my way to search for as many optional dungeons and just to explore to my heart's content. And was it all a good time? Well, not really. There is my issue with the harder bosses, and in my opinion, I'm not happy with how difficult it can be depending on your build and your playstyle. The Dark Souls games have always been about making your personal playstyle work, but with a reliance on strength weapons and a great shield like I would in the previous games, I just don't see it working out. But honestly, a large part of that could be on me. Maybe I didn't employ the right strategies or make good enough use of my equipment, and I'm willing to concede on that front, to a certain extent. Some of the bosses, like Commander Niall, I don't even know how the hell I'm supposed to do it. On the other end of the spectrum, there's a few bosses that can be fought on horseback, and that makes them feel trivial. Like just tossing magic spells at a dragon while riding away. This boss in particular was especially goofy. There's nothing he can do as long as I stay on my horse, which makes the whole thing feel like a time waster. But what's even worse than overly difficult bosses or really stupid bosses? The recycled bosses are extremely inexcusable. The amount of times I said, "Come on, this guy again?" It really got out of hand. If you're gonna explore all you can like I did, get used to seeing this jerk, he's everywhere. Granted, the bosses are usually recycled in the optional mini-dungeons, but still, that makes up a huge portion of the game. Let's say you ignore that. What do you have left? Like 5 main dungeons that are actually decently designed? The capital city sucks. It's so wide open and stretched out, it takes forever to explore it all. Don't even get me started on the sewers. It's an obnoxious maze where it's easy to get lost. The only saving grace for that one is that it's completely optional. And then, 2 of the main bosses in the story don't even have dungeons associated with them at all. It's such a jip. So then you mainly have the mini dungeons to help fill in the gaps. And they're cool at first, but it doesn't take long for everything to start looking the same and feeling like a chore. I would rather that they scrapped all the mini dungeons and instead put that effort towards just one more well-designed main dungeon and maybe a new boss too. And get rid of the open world aspect as well while you're at it. I just don't see what it adds to the game aside from simply being novel and exploring purely for the sake of it. Out of all the Souls games, I think I still dislike Dark Souls 2 the most. That one just had, like, the worst level layouts. But Elden Ring isn't doing itself any favors. It does so much right with the controls and customization, but the level design isn't really there, and the amount of recycled content is ridiculous. The open world aspect is both novel and beautiful, but I do wonder how much it actually adds to the game. If anything, the main thing it does is hide really overpowered gear in places that are easy to overlook because you've got 1,000 places to explore. If I never found the Hoarfrost Stomp ability, I don't know what I'd do. It is worth noting that some of the more absurdly overpowered abilities have already gotten nerfed with the latest patch. But from what I can tell of others playing online, it hasn't made that much of a difference. They simply look for the next weapons and abilities to abuse. Out of all these games, Elden Ring feels like it is the most poorly balanced one yet. That might be what makes me hate it more than anything else. It's also possible that part of this might have to do with my own fatigue over the series. Demon's Souls released 13 years ago, and Elden Ring marks the 6th game of this style, if you count Bloodborne. So that's an average of almost 1 game every 2 years. That's part of what made Sekiro so refreshing. It was much closer to a traditional action game and everything was balanced around a particular playstyle. Other competitors have also been inspired to make their own versions of these kinds of games, like Code Vein and Nioh. Mileage may vary, sure, but at least it's something different. Then again, maybe I'm just getting sick of the L1, R1 circle dodge gameplay. But I'm not gonna say that Elden Ring is bad. If you're a fan of these games, then I think that, for the most part, Elden Ring is still a safe bet as long as you take my criticisms to heart and you decide if it sounds worth it to you. For newcomers to the series, it's okay. and the summoning spirits are there to make your life a whole lot easier. I think Demon Souls and Bloodborne are better starting points since they're much more straightforward, but Elden Ring isn't bad either. I guess this game just isn't for me. It left me kind of disappointed, and more than anything, I'm just glad it's over. Thanks for watching my review on Elden Ring.